Hi, this is Jim Leffler. We're going to continue the Psychodynamic Psychotherapy Technique course, session 10. Today I'm going to focus on play as a emotion and as a drive. And I actually am going to privilege play as one of the most important elements of psychotherapy and kind of the human emotional repertoire. And it may feel like you have to do this. Maybe Freud privileged sexual attraction, libido, Jung, the life force, Melanie Klein, aggression, other things. But here I'm going to privilege play and recognize that I think it's really vital. So in review, sessions 1 to 4, we kind of described listening. 5 and 6, we developed from projective identification the idea of the container contained. 7 and 8 went through some specific technical moves, including types of interpretation, as well as how to use narrative, metaphor as play elements, and we'll talk about that more. And then last session introduced emotions as described by Jaak Panksepp in affective neuroscience and reimagined into psychoanalysis by Mark Solms. So we kind of ended last week that certain emotional systems can get shut down. Certain emotional systems can become dominant in somebody's life. Actually, a pretty good way of seeing this, if you're interested in a pictorial representation of this and how emotions are at the bottom and maybe driving our behavior, is the movie Inside Out. I really think that that's a nice way to see uh, in image form what I'm kind of getting at the last session in the session. But one way to get shut down systems back online is through play. So I'm going to describe play as a drive. If you'll recall, there's 7 emotional drives as described by Jaak Panksepp. Other people have described different numbers. Tompkins, who is another individual that got very interested in emotional systems, had a different list, but I'm just going to go with these. And so if you recall, seeking, which would be similar to Freud's libido, this one sends us out into the world to try to find things. Rage, fear, panic, grief, and care are kind of related. These are the attachment-related drives. Panic, grief. If someone separates from their caregiver, they may start to feel panic and grief, and then that pushes them back to find safety in the caregiver who can provide care. Lust, kind of sexual appetite. And then play, you'll remember that the drives aren't like a singular space in the brain, but that Jaak Panksepp described them more as systems that get turned on and interface with one another and can overlap. Play actually is a system that bounces between all of them and seems to be able to like enlist different systems during play. And that say you can learn rage and fear within the context of, say, wrestling or hide and seek. And then you can play doctor or parent and you engage care, the care system. And we know that this actually is preserved across all mammals. So in mammals, and if you think about if you've ever seen a dog or any mammals kind of engage in play, there's usually an invitation. So kind of some kind of invitation behavior, posture. There's turn taking in terms of who's on top. And we actually know that if an animal, even if there's a dominant animal and a non-dominant animal, if the dominant animal doesn't intentionally lose, say 20, 30% of the time, the other animal will just stop playing with them. So there has to actually be some learning that, oh, I can't always win if I want to have people around me. And if mammals don't get play one day, they'll actually double the amount of play they do the next in order to kind of make up for the loss. And then play in the human field and the adult is verbal play, especially in psychoanalysis with free association, metaphors we talked about 2 sessions ago, narrative, and dreams. These are all kind of ways to play with language. And it allows you to try on the other experiences. When your kids, cops and robbers would be another game. Creates an as if scenario. Solms would say, kind of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis is at bottom a form of play. And is this just something Solms came up with? And so I'm actually going to now bring up that maybe there's a richer, longer tradition of play in psychoanalysis, and two names that definitely come to mind are Melanie Klein and Anna Freud. And as you all may know, so Anna Freud is Sigmund Freud's daughter. Melanie Klein was not analyzed by Sigmund Freud, but by Abraham, one of Freud's direct analysands. But both of these women were interested in how to engage with children and provide psychoanalytic treatment to children. So Melanie Klein is who I'm first going to talk here. And they had these like famous debates in the 1920s. So in Britain, the Psychoanalytic Society at the time gets split into three factions: the Anna Freud faction, the Melanie Klein faction, and what's called the middle group or the independent group. And there are famous people across those. The middle group, most famously, will be Winnicott, who I'll bring up in just a second. Maybe not most famously, but additionally. So Melanie Klein, kids quickly recognizes, kids aren't going to lie on a couch, and pioneers play technique kind of as the equivalent of free association in children, teaching a child's spontaneous play with toys as a direct symbolic expression of unconscious fantasy, anxiety, and internal object relationships. For Klein, play revealed the child's most primitive, aggressive, and reparative impulses, which the analyst could interpret directly and deeply, often tracing them to part-object relations and the paranoid, schizoid, and depressive positions. Play was thus recreation. Play was thus not recreation, but more now. Play was Klein's royal road into the child's unconscious, which you maybe have heard that phrase before, that Freud would say dreams were the royal road into the unconscious of an adult. So Anna Freud also approaches play. She comes much more cautiously. She views it as a valuable observational material, but maybe resists Klein's move to read it as straightforwardly symbolic content, equivalent to not necessarily equivalent to free association. She emphasized that it could build a real working alliance with the child, but would recognize that you have to also focus on ego defenses and developmental level before any deep interpretations, which Kleinian analysts are kind of known for kind of very deep interpretations historically. That may not be the case today. And play also needs to be understood within a developmental and pedagogical timeline, and it's not just a window into unconscious fantasy. But I think both would say play is where the unspeakable becomes available. Okay, and then Winnicott writes this book in 1971, Playing in Reality, and Winnicott has this like famous, or there's like kind of this somewhat famous idea. He seems to have been kind of a really uniquely skilled therapist who could, in just a session or two, really turn people's lives around. He was a pediatrician. He has a lot of witty, pithy sayings that kind of stay. He was the one who said, "There's no such thing as an infant," which that adds in then this idea that there's only infant and mother, or infant and caretaker, we might say today, meaning an infant can't survive without another person to provide for it. He also was the one that came up with the good enough mother, kind of saying that you don't have to be perfect, you just got to be good enough to get someone to where they need to be. And Winnicott reframes play itself as a central therapeutic phenomenon, locating it in what he would call the potential or transitional space between inner and outer reality, where the self creatively comes into being. In Winnicott's view, the capacity to play is an achievement tied to the reliability of the early environment, and the aim of therapy is to bring the patient from a state of not being able to play into one of being able to play. His squiggle game embodied the mutual improvisational quality, treating play as a shared creative act rather than primarily material for interpretation. And then more recently, so Peter Fonagy and Mary Target write a series of articles, 4 articles from the 1990s into the early 2000s, called Playing with Reality. You can see how they borrow off Winnicott there. And their idea really becomes, builds from those early articles into a whole concept of mentalization, which I can't go into right now. I actually have other videos on mentalization and attachment, which you're welcome to go and see on my channel. But they have a concept of pretend play, where this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. In pretend play, you can try on being the father, the child, the son, the doctor, the good guy, the bad guy, which allows you to then enlist these other emotional centers and helps you develop within the sandbox of play. And it can move concepts from being like things in themselves. So fear becomes a monster under the bed. You play hide and seek, you get afraid, you learn that you're cared for, and then fear becomes something that you experience internally, as opposed to being sure that it creeps under your bed. It allows an as if quality for feelings to be experienced as real, that they do exist, that there is fear, there is rage, there is other things, but they're not real in the external world. So it kind of helps like the internalization process and so on. So they also think about play. So play for the adult could be in dreams, metaphor, narratives, free association, and interpretation. And it takes a raw emotion too fused to reality, too dangerous to approach head on, and creates a sandbox that can be worked through in an as if quality. The patient can love, hate, curse, yell, not show up, as if the therapist and work through the therapist being the patient's mother, father, boss, spouse, right there. So you can see Freud even had this play as if quality in his whole idea of transference. So thinking about a hypothetical, the 40-year-old flat man. That flat means like lacks really any emotion, maybe some alexithymia, with a great deal of loss. And so lost parents, lost job, lost relationships. And I'm just going to go through a completely made up series of back and forths and read those, and then at the end show how the therapist could choose many options to play with the emotions that could be involved. Therapist, I can imagine that me not responding to your email last night could leave you feeling, and I intentionally left this kind of 3 dots. Sometimes I actually will not say the feeling, but it's a leading question to allow them to fill that in. No, it's fine. I know you're busy, and I'm just one of many patients. And then the therapist could use kind of an Alvarez's it interpretation, and that then leads into a you interpretation. It can be hard to allow yourself to feel angry or disappointed. And the patient, look, I said it was fine. Though I really did kind of have a hope that you might at least acknowledge you got the email. Patient continues, but I guess that is to be expected. You're busy, and I know on some level, if I reached out, you wouldn't respond. That's just the way it is. You don't really care about me. You listen because I pay you. That's kind of sad and pathetic, even as I say that out loud. And I was just underlining here in the different colors that we had used of the systems that are getting activated. So the care system, on some level, if I reached out, I knew you wouldn't respond. There's an assumption that you won't receive care. That's a transference, also projection onto the therapist. You don't really care about me. Again, I'm stating that even more clearly. You listen because I pay you. Now that is like a kind of a diminution of this care need, and using a little bit of rage to diminish that without kind of acknowledging it as it's a bit of an attack, saying that the therapist couldn't care and only cares because they're getting paid. And then again, using fear and kind of critique to diminish kind of this panic grief. That's kind of sad, well, really pathetic, as I say that out loud. Now, the therapists themselves could use a lot of options. And I'm not assuming that one single option is right, but here we go. So you could interpret these transference elements. You could name a dependency need, like, wow, it could be hard to care. What's it like to feel care? What's it like to want to be cared for? You could acknowledge the anger. You'd only listen because I pay you. You can wonder what it might be like if the therapist had answered. What could they imagine that could happen? All of these are playing with emotions. Sounds like you're like diminishing them, and I'm not at all. I'm taking play very serious, like professional play, like Major League Baseball level play. So we're not diminishing it. And I actually think that play is the work of children, so I'm not diminishing that either. I think it's how they grow and develop and move into new roles and take on new ideas and progress, etc. And then you could even wait and see kind of what comes next. So I hope I'm demonstrating how I think that play is a vital part of the psychoanalytic process and allows this enlistment of the other emotional processes. And then at the bottom of psychotherapy is all a form of play. All right. Thanks so much.